Good day everyone and welcome to the Sim channel. This week I've got something special for you guys. I got to sit down with Niels Heusinkveld to talk in depth about the Heusinkveld Engineering Pro and Sprint pedals, the differences between them, and about upcoming products. Yes, there are product announcements in this video. What you're getting here is the full version of our conversation, although I did allow myself to rearrange some of the questions and cut down my own talking time a little to keep it more entertaining for you. It's packed with technical detail and should provide a very complete picture of the differences between the Pro and Sprint pedal sets. So if you're thinking about buying the Sprints, or maybe even a used set of Pros, this is definitely the right video for you. For those of you who can't or don't want to spend 80 minutes on this, I'll soon condense the essence of this discussion into a much shorter review of the Sprints. So make sure you subscribe to the channel for that, and while you're at it, leave a like and let me know what questions you'd like to have answered about the Sprints. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Well, Niels, thank you for joining us. Thank you for meeting me here on Zoom. How are things in Groningen right now?
We had our spring 2 days ago. It came and it went, so now it's cold and miserable again. But things are pretty well here. Crazy times, obviously. No need to elaborate too much on that. But as crazy as the times are for all sorts of reasons, strangely for sim racing, as you're probably aware, it meant like a big boost in people joining sim racing and needing hardware. So strangely, we have grown considerably the last year, and that comes with its issues and difficulties, which are very much luxury problems. And believe me, we would have rather had this whole thing not happen and just grow steadily, slowly, as we always do, which is more comfortable for us, and it means less global issues with all the pandemic stuff. So it's been a challenge on that front. Although as we've grown, I'm a bit more detached from the daily operation, so I can just focus on looking at my CAD display and twiddling my thumbs and pretending to think of new things. So we have sort of implemented new ways of warehouse management and things like that. So all the supply and stuff that comes in is better organized, and you have a more firm grasp of what's going on. We've changed the method of assembly. You visited us a couple of years ago. We're doing things completely differently now, with assembly stations and with actual manuals for every operation that people do. So if you're new to assembly, you don't have to rely on some wizard who's worked there for 4 years to tell you how to do it. But there's like a manual, and we now make products from beginning to end, like sequentially, instead of sort of everybody doing a part and then putting the half products back in the warehouse and then somebody takes them out again. It wasn't very optimized, and we've optimized that, so our capacity has grown from more people, but also from working a bit smarter. And that has enabled us, thankfully, to finally sort of meet the demand again last year. And now things are still going pretty fast, but the craziness as far as the sim racing hype is gone. So now it's still going very well, but the craziness has stopped a little bit. So it's a little bit more peace and quiet now.
Good to hear you're making it well through the pandemic. And yeah, but the main thing why we're talking today is we want to talk about the Pros and the Sprint pedals, right? The Sprints were probably the first pedal set that you developed with a lot of user feedback from the Pros and the Ultimates to possibly take advantage of. How much did that impact the development of the Sprints, or was it more that you took your own experience with the Pros and Ultimates to improve for the Sprints?
Well, the marketing answer would be that, we took all your feedback and we used all your feedback and then made a better pedal set. In practice, a tiny bit, yeah, but a lot of it was just, okay, we know what we can do better, and we know some of the weak points of the Pro pedals. So we set like 90% of the direction ourselves. But one of the things we heard a lot was people wanted a softer brake pedal, softer than the softest Pro combination of rubbers you could use. So that was something we had in mind, was to develop something that would be stiffer with less pedal travel at the same force, but also a lot spongier for those calibrating 10, 20 kilos of force to still have some motion. So that's, from memory, I think the main thing we didn't really want this ourselves. We tend to drive with 50 or more kilos with a stiff pedal, but a lot of people drive in socks and perhaps don't have a sturdy rig. So yeah, we were surprised that there was a desire to have a softer pedal, but we definitely took that to heart, and in the softest stack of rubbers you can do on the sprints feels horribly mushy to me, but that's what I would not use, so I would go with a single short rubber to get a nice firm pedal, but that option is there, so the range is increased.
I just tried that setting for the first time like 3 days ago. I sort of agree with your opinion on that, but it's good that it's there. I could imagine one reason is that many compare it to their road car at home, and usually the travel on road cars in the brake pedal is fairly substantial compared to a stiff racing brake. So maybe in going to that direction, that might have been the reason that people are longing for a longer, softer pedal. Anyway, the first thing when you compare the pros and the sprints that pops out is the design. So the pros and ultimates, they're looking really industrial and raw, and the sprints are more refined. They have colors now, or they have the bluish dark gray color for the main parts, and I would say they're quite beautiful for a set of pedals. So who's responsible for the design?
So the shape and everything is everything that just comes from wanting to design something in a minimum package, as compact as possible. And there's very little artistic shaping of parts. I don't really know how to do that. I don't really care about it. I just know where are my forces. How can I make it as compact as possible while still allowing you to, press 90 kilos on the brake without everything exploding? And what is the resulting shape from the requirements of everything? So that's not something that there's barely any aesthetic reason to involved in shaping. Color wise, yeah, the reason was with the Pro pedals they were tumbled, so it was stainless steel tumbled in it's little like a tumble washing machine almost, with there are like little stones in them and some water and soapy substance. It gets tumbled and then all the edges of the material get sort of smoothed. However, we saw some variability there with the quality of the finish, that sometimes it was a bit darker, a little bit sort of, I wouldn't say dirty, it wasn't like when you rubbed your finger over it was black, but sometimes it was nice and shiny, sometimes it was a bit dark. That final finish wasn't great. And then we looked at powder coating, which is something that you can do all the colors you want, but then it makes no sense to use stainless steel because you're hiding the steel anyway and it's not gonna rust. So we went with normal steel, which is cheaper than stainless steel, yay. So conspiracy, they want to make it cheaper, but then you do the powder coating and it's exactly the same price as stainless steel is to begin with. So there's not really a cost saving there, but that means you can do something with colors. And we went with the finish on the Ultimate, which is blasted with small glass particles, and you get sort of a micro texture or almost. We do that for the angle brackets on the side and also the foot faces. So it makes a mix of the Ultimate appearance, which is blasted, plus the powder coating. And we went with sort of a very dark gray, anthracite or something it is called. But yeah, you mentioned it does look too blue especially in artificial light. It looks a bit more blue than in natural light. So the idea was to do very dark gray, but it does look quite bluish depending on the light in your camera. Yeah. But that was a choice. We didn't really have to do that. We could have gone with stainless steel and do it like the Ultimates, but since we've grown a lot and also sort of went from just, I put them together in 2013, like batch sizes of 20 pedals, everything's moved up, and also we wanted to be have like a more finished, a more professional, like consumer product that you would pick up and, oh yeah, this is pretty nice, instead of, oh, this is quite raw, or oh, this is a bit sort of smudgy and dirty looking. We wanted to step up there in just the appearance, and you can do that with the combination we came up with powder coating. It would wear off the pedal faces, so that's why we went with stainless steel and did the blasting there. So you have a durable finish on that. So that was not something that was necessary for my sort of very, just design it and shape it the way it has to be to cope with all the forces and to go with the minimum packaging. That was an aesthetic choice where other people, I remember we had various colors powder coated, and then all the guys came from the assembly as well. We just stood around it. Well, which would you pick? And we decided on, well, everybody does black pedals. Let's do something different. Let's be cheeky. And we went with the dark gray. So that was purely an aesthetic choice indeed, for a more professional appearance. That also goes for the packaging, which was just a whole bunch of bubble wrap thrown in a box, and there's your pedals. And I'm not gonna say we're saving the planet, but all that plastic was a bit stupid. So now we have cardboard inlays that secure all the pedals in place, and just a few cardboards that you can easily recycle. So everything, and the manual as well, is instead of a inkjet print out with some, yeah, do this, do that, we now have a book with nice images on how to adjust everything. So it's just part of the overall pretty big step up in, okay, we're a real company now. We gotta ship something that's packaged well with a nice manual and that looks more presentable and less sort of one guy made it in his attic. So that's overall evolution, I think, of yeah.
I'm looking at them in natural light right now, and I would, so from where I'm sitting, they look bluish,
Yeah,
even
yeah.
in natural light. But I mean, the pedal faces, they look somewhat designed with the, I guess, laser cut or water blasted H for Heusinkveld. I think overall it's a fairly beautiful set of pedals. So well done on
Thanks.
that.
Yeah.
Now let's go through the pedals one by one and talk more about the technical side of them. So the throttle pedal is the one that's probably seen the least amount of change. In terms of how it feels, I would describe it as very similar, but you can set it up to be stiffer on the sprints than on the pros. So was there any special idea behind that?
Well, not really. So again, the packaging is super important, that I wanted it to be as small as possible. But it is easy to make something small, but it's not quite as easy to make something small but still very strong or have a lot of resistance. So there was a certain space for the spring, and depending on the diameter you have available for the spring and the length, you can design a spring that has a long life. And since on the Pro pedals, I think we were constricted or restrained by just the maximum spring life we could reach. So we had to go with a weaker spring in order for the pedal to last a million cycles. And with the sprints designed from the ground up with better understanding of how springs work, we could do a stiffer spring that was still pretty durable, and you could always adjust it lower in the slot to reduce the resistance again. But I do agree it's quite stiff, and yeah, not a lot of people use that, I don't think, but it's part of that offering a bigger range than the Pro pedals. Just like with the brake pedal, the throttle pedal as well, you can, especially if you go for a very short throw, then it might be more desirable to have, if you want 8 kilos at the end of the pedal and you have very short throw, you need a lot stiffer spring to do that. So there's more adjustment room for that, and the spring might not last a million or 2 million cycles if it's almost flattened, but it will still last a long time, and there's just more room to, despite the more compact packaging, to get more stiffness in the pedal from the spring point of view.
Let's move on to the clutch. It seems to be indicated that the Pro clutch maximum pressure is higher than the Sprint. which does not match my experience. So on
Yeah,
my set, yeah,
I think at some point, but the pro pedals are sort of in such so far in the past that my
yeah.
aging man's memory doesn't seem to recall properly. But I think we went from a stiffer to a slightly weaker spring on the pro pedals, like after a year or two, because it
Mm.
was sort of nearing its safe compression and we had some breakages. So it might be that the charts with the forces you saw are from the old spring and we perhaps didn't update it.
Yeah.
Second point is that the maximum force might be higher on the pros, but then it wasn't dropping off like we kind of wanted to. So it felt more like a throttle pedal in the stiffer setting.
Mm.
But I think it
Um,
was the spring that we saw some
mhm.
breakages and we went with a thinner wire diameter, so or more windings that makes it a little softer.
From my point of view, the clutch got stiffer, and you also managed a slightly harder fall off of the forces beyond the engagement point of the clutch. Was that mostly done by from your own experience? Was that something you desired, or was this inspired by customer feedback mostly?
Mainly our sort of we found a couple of like measurements of real clutch pedals, and like I think I mentioned, the issue with the pro pedals was that clutch curve where it gets a bit lighter at the end, it really depended on how you adjusted the pedals, what sort of curve you got. And with the sprint, we took out the travel adjustability, so clutches typically have quite a bit of travel, and while it might be faster, I don't know if you want to shift to have a super short clutch travel, it's not realistic. So we made a decision to take the travel adjustment out and then have only 3 force settings with all 3. Now this is again from memory because we do this in spreadsheets, obviously, with the final force being 70% or 65% of the peak force. So regardless of which of the 3 holes you pick, you get the same curvature, just at a higher maximum, or if you lower the hole, you get a lower overall force, but the shape is exactly the same in low, medium, or high force setting, which is far more consistent than with the pro pedals, where you could almost get it to be a throttle pedal, and you could just with the travel, you would not be guaranteed to have a nice clutch feel with the pro, depending on how you adjusted it. We also thought, well, the clutch has to be smoother, which is a lot smoother probably on the springs than it was on the pros. Easier for us to assemble in a way that it is always smooth as well. But we felt it was more important to have that feel of a slightly dropping force curve and just keep the adjustments a bit less convoluted than with the pro pedals.
What kind of cars did you get data from for the clutch pedal?
Only road cars, so it's very easy to find if you just Google like an image search for clutch, pedal, force, curve, feel, evaluation, characteristics. You'll find some of a couple different cars, and they are quite varied. There are, and as we might get to, over a year ago, I was forced to get a new car, and I test drove a few, and the clutch felt quite different from car to car. But typically they drop off a certain amount, and that was more sort of evidence that that happened most of the time anyway, and that made us do like this. Well, let's have it drop to 66 or 70% at the end, and that feels good, because if it gets too light at the end and then you release it, it might sort of kick you back suddenly. So it's nice that if it drops but not super hard, you can easily bring it back without the spring suddenly pushing your foot beyond the point where the car starts to move. And also the mechanism of that, if here is the spring and here's your pedal, they are more in a straight line towards the end. And if you want a lot of drop off, they almost are in one line between them. Now I'm giving away secrets how to make a clutch pedal, but hey, if you risk that point, it won't come back, so you have to keep some safety margin. And that's where we ended up with the feel. Very much subjective, but I think an improvement that no matter what setting you do, it always feels the way we think a clutch pedal should feel, rather than with the Pro, where you could make it feel like a throttle pedal.
From my experience, clutch pedals can feel dramatically different in road cars. The sprints now, they feel very believable.
And smoother too, because the hinge at the back and the length of the spring, everything is a bit more optimized and smoother. So
yeah,
with the pro pedals and sometimes on the Ultimate as well, it can be a little, there can be a little bit of friction in there, and that's almost completely gone with the sprint. So it feels overall a bit smoother.
Okay, so now the main pedal, the brake pedal. On the Pro, you had a maximum force of 55 kilos at the pedal face, whereas now you went up to 65. What made you change your target?
That's actually not really complicated. It's just that, well, do we want to sell the better upgraded version of the pedals with less pedal force or more pedal force? You're gonna go with a bit more, but at the same time, this was more aimed towards like enthusiast home gamers and not so much for pro drivers. So we didn't really see the point in upgrading everything to deal with 100 kilos or more. You know, the ultimate pedals are for that, but we did want to improve the maximum force a little bit. Subjectively, we went with a value that's significantly more than certain competitors and also a bit more than what we used to do. So it was very firm, but we saw more people using a surprisingly low amount of force on the pro pedals than a high amount of force. But again, that's that if you can go between like 0 and 55, or now you can go between 0 and 65, you just offer a little bit more range. That's sort of the recurring theme with the sprint pedals, offer more adjustability, more range, because not only are real brake pedals all over the place, the people that play the sims and the games, some drive with socks, are tiny legs, and some are big bulky guys with Wellingtons. You know, there's a very big range of what people prefer, and that's offered better by having a slightly stiffer, higher force brake pedal. At least have that option to people.
Do you have a lot of real world data on brake pressure in road and race cars? And I'm talking especially about the force at the pedal, not so much the hydraulic pressure in the system. I'm asking also because you make a point, and rightfully so, that the force you indicate in your description, the 55 or 65 kilos, are measured at the pedal face, whereas I guess some competitors will, for example, specify the force at the load cell, which can be off by a factor of 3 or 4 even.
Yeah, that's a little bit annoying. I think it's all marketing, because if you ask the average guy buys a home cinema system, here's the 100 watts option for 500 euros, and there we have the 8,000 watt RMS watt. You gotta have that one because the number is bigger. And typically the load cell rating is larger than the pedal force. And that's why a lot of times, well, we have a 200 kilogram load cell, but then mounted in such a leveraged way that it's 50 kilos on the pedal. So either it's marketing, or they don't understand their own mechanism, but that's weird. So they probably do understand their own mechanism. It's probably just go with the biggest number, but we find that terribly confusing, because you don't, you know, it can, what you say, it can be anything, 1-to-1, 5-to-1, you never know. So that's why we could say it's got a 120 kilo load cell because that's what it has, but that doesn't tell you anything. So we prefer to say it's got a 65 kilo pedal rather than a certain load cell. But real data is on the forces is very hard to come by. You do get, I've worked with a couple of racing teams, of course, with Physics and Automobilista and some customers. You get pressures, and it's so confused all around the internet. You will find like car reviewer does a track day, and he says he had to press the pedal with 100 bar. But that's not a force, that's whatever the pressure is in the system, and we don't know anything. You know, I can get 100 bar with my pinky if there's enough leverage. It's very easy to get 100 bar. So pressures are useless for finding out the pedal force. You have to know exactly what sort of master cylinders they use, what sort of pedal it is, with all the ratios, then you can calculate it. So brake data from telemetry from racing cars typically only has the pressure, and sometimes they have the dimensions of the pedal, and you can work it back with the master cylinders, and you can find out what the pedal force is. But a lot of the time you don't really get that. I do have a spreadsheet where you can put in all these variables, and you can come up with an expected pedal force. But that does make assumptions along the way, and there are just so many variables. Even with the same car, you can change the cylinders, the master cylinders that are in the brake pedal, those two cylinders that you press in that hydraulic pedals tend to have. If the diameter of those is different, then you get a different leverage, different force ratios. So you could you could drive a Formula 2 car and need 150 kilos, and then you can change those cylinders and you would only need 100 kilos, but you get more pedal travel. It is so variable. And then the brake pads, perhaps you have endurance pads that have less friction, or sprint pads that wear out sooner but offer more friction. So typically though, for racing cars that are not power assisted, it very soon goes over 65 kilos, really soon. That's just a physical part of racing that is real and that you don't expect, and is so much more than road cars with power assisted brakes where you feel nothing and then your head goes through the windscreen. So the range of forces there is huge, and that's also, again, seems to be recurring theme, that offer more adjustability, and then people will find whatever they like and probably they can use it, unless you're super hardcore into real simulation and you want to do the pedal force training. Then no, then you cannot really use the sprints. But for serious home use, you have quite a range of available forces. But as far as what is realistic, it will be literally all over the place. Even the same car with slightly different components, you can look at half or double the brake force probably.
Moving on from the force of the pedal to, I guess, the feel of the pedal. The initial coil spring, you've had those in the pros, you still have them in the sprints, but they've changed a bit. It's now in the sprints, it's quite a bit stiffer, it's a beefier spring. I would assume that this is to make for a smoother transition between sort of the spring phase of the pedal travel and then the rubber bushing phase of the travel. In the pros, I always felt you would hit the end of the spring travel, it was sort of like a stop, and then you would push on the rubber, whereas now it's like a smoother transition. Was that your idea, or was there any other thoughts that went into that?
That is definitely part of it. Also, if you look at the leverage on the pro pedals, about halfway up the pedal arm is the rod with the spring and the bump rubbers, and with the sprint it's about a third. So purely to get the same feel, you would need a considerably stiffer spring, because that is a function of this leverage ratio squared, so times itself. So if that is 3, then the spring is a factor of 9, and if it's 2, the spring is a factor of 4. So it has to be over twice as stiff to provide the same feel. So that plus it is actually a little bit stiffer. The idea indeed is that if you minimize the preload, you can still start the pedal at the same force, but it ramps up a little quicker and indeed blends with the rubbers instead of bumping into them. It's a bit more of a smooth transition, yes.
Yeah. And the overall idea of having this initial coil spring would be that you usually have a little bit of a gap between the brake, the brake disc and the brake pads, and you would close that gap. Is that right?
That's true, and also pedals will have a return spring, most likely, a slight return spring. And also in the master cylinders, there's a reservoir on them with extra brake fluid. When your pads were out, of course, then there's a bit more. You would get a longer pedal, and every time you retract the pedal, there is an option. Now I don't know these things, like I haven't got away them and I don't know exactly, but there's a reservoir. When the pedal is fully retracted, I think the reservoir has contact with the loop and so it can refill itself. And then when you start to press it beyond the reservoir opening, then you build up the pressure. So there's always a little bit of initial motion in the main cylinders, I think, before they can even build up pressure. So that's the fact that there is a return spring and there is some initial dead zone basically in all hydraulic wheel pedals, after which it ramps up. And then, there is a little bit of a gap between the brake disc and the pad, but there is also, strangely enough, there is fluid compression in a braking system. We've always learned in school that a fluid doesn't compress, but there is actually measurable brake travel coming from fluid compression. But there's a hose expansion, there are all sorts of factors and O-rings and stuff like that mean that there's a little bit of dead zone and then it sort of ramps up. And after that, it could be reasonably linear. It sometimes seems to be a little bit progressive because the clutch forces I mentioned you can find if you Google them. You can also find some road car brake force curves as well. And it depends on a whole bunch of things. Again, if there's one thing with pedals, and especially brake pedals, is that the force and the feel just can be all over the place from manufacturer and parts and car differences. So it's that coil spring we have is sort of okay, there are a billion things happening in the real brake system before it gets firm. We're going to simplify that to essentially being a sort of soft initial phase and then a hard phase. And that's, you don't really care too much about the initial itty little bit of travel, because that's not where the real braking happens. It's just that, there is a little bit of travel, but once you're braking hard, then it's just a stiff spring effectively that you feel. And so we didn't want to overcomplicate that first centimeter or two of travel, because it's effectively just, it's there, but it's not where you do your braking, your real braking anyway, because it's low forces. So a spring in our mind is a reasonable way of doing that. And regarding the Pro and the Sprint, one of the things that you can just see that the Pro is an older design. We just had the spring floating in there, and with the Sprint we had like with a company that does milling and CNC turning. So they make a centering bushing for us that provides centering positioning of the spring. So it's all tighter and more consistent compared to when it moves around. Everything can get a little crooked. So it's more consistent there as well.
You also changed the rubber bushings. You went from having various wide, thin bushings on the rod, basically in the Pros, to now having these larger black, like larger diameter black bushings. And by default in the setup that it ships, there's only one of them in there. What motivated this change? How are the black ones now better than the white ones that we had before?
The problem-ish with the white ones, we still use them on the Ultimate, but we also have stiffer, green. There are 80 Shore and the white ones are 70 Shore. They're sort of pretty good quality components that you can buy off the shelf, but the downside is if you phone them up and you say, this white color, I don't like it, can you make it orange? Then they say no. And this diameter and these lengths, what about changing them? They also say no. So there's a very limited option you have with sizes and colors. And since we were optimizing the brake pedal and we decided to go with powder coating and better aesthetics really. White rubbers with text that flakes off, it's not what we wanted. So we went to a local rubber party and they optimized compound for us, and we can specify any size that we want. And then it turned out that slightly thicker out of dimension bushings managed to give us, like I mentioned, on the Pro pedal, the spring and the rubbers are halfway, and on the Sprint they're much lower, which also means that the force is a lot higher on them. So they have to be beefed up, and that's why they are thicker. And by being able to specify the diameter, we can optimize that we want, for example, a certain angle of travel with a certain length of rubber. We could specify that much more precisely than being stuck to a limited availability of standard ugly colors springs. So that helped us a lot. The material is also different because we did see some breakages of the white and sometimes also of the green bushings. They were quite near their maximum stress when pressing the Pro at 50 something kilos. You were fairly close to that, and if you overload the pedal they would sometimes sort of squish and get damaged. Now, in normal operation that wouldn't happen, but there's always people who think that pressing harder, even though you're already smoke is appearing off the tires or ABS is kicking in, pressing harder always better. So sometimes we would see breakages, and then we'd have to send with like €40 cost to ship to Australia 4 rubbers that cost €3 each. So we wanted to minimize the amount of replacements that we did, and that's why this compound is more durable as well. So that helps a lot.
Since you mentioned it a couple of times, the leverage on that the pedal face has over the rod, basically in the brake pedal. You mentioned how you went from a 1:2 to a 1:3 ratio there. Why?
So yeah, that's a good question. It all comes back down to wanting to have the pedals as compact as possible, and typically a spring or a rubber bushing, if it's a certain length, you can safely compress it 25% of its length, for example. So imagine if you have a 1:1 ratio and you want 100 millimeters of travel, that means you need 400 millimeters of rubber before you can safely compress that 100 millimeters. So that's huge. And with the lower you can mount the rubber, the less movement it will have, right? So if you have 100 millimeters here, we only have 30 millimeters here. And in order to move 30 millimeters, if you can have 25%, you get like, you only need 100 millimeters or 120 millimeters of rubber stack in there. So these are not the exact numbers, but you can quickly see that having this much spring or rubber, people will screen grab this and make assumptions by what I'm doing now, but hey, whatever. This versus that is a very big difference to how big your pedal will be, and that means that the more leverage you can have, you deal with a lot higher forces, but if you can make sure that doesn't break anything, then you can get a more compact pedal.
So now, a personal observation to me, the sprint brake, it feels somewhat more dampened and more like I would say that it feels like the rubber is more like a sponge and it's not as elastically repelling. But I'm not sure, is this an illusion that I get from the smoother transition between the spring and the rubber face of the travel, or is there really anything that is different in that regard, like some internal dampening in the rubber?
Yeah, definitely there's a difference in material. So I think there are 2 reasons for this. First is that the white rubbers on the Pro pedals, they have a more sort of progressive curve in how stiff they get, and our new bushings are more linear. And also there is more damping in the compound that we use compared to the one that we used to have on the Pro pedals. So it does feel a bit more sort of damped, and to some extent we are still sort of looking at this. What do we want it to do? Because we're like Pirelli now, we can make all the compounds that we want, but we don't really understand how it works. No, that's not true, we don't understand how it works, but our supplier of course does. So we're sort of looking at what's the optimum, because we don't have any hydraulic components in the sprint pedal, unlike the Ultimate. So there is an element of damping in real brake pedals, because there is the fluids going through the hoses and you get a little bit of damping effect, and we have a bit of damping in the rubber bushings. It's more apparent when the softer you use your rubbers. If you go with a single short rubber, then you feel it a lot less than when you have a mushy pedal by doing 2 big rubbers, for example. But it is definitely a difference, yes, and we're evaluating the situation also with future products, because you can sort of, you're a bit like a magician, you can play with the compound and have it more purely elastic or more damped. And even that's subjective, because you will find real pedals probably that feel more damped and others that are more purely elastic. So it's more or less a subjective thing that we did, and we felt that if you go with a shorter rubber, you get less of that damped feeling and a more race car feeling, and if you go softer, you feel that damping a bit more. But that's mostly subjective, really.
Yeah, but then it wasn't completely just my perception playing tricks on me. So there is Personally, I really like this bit of dampening that they bring, make it feel more realistic to me, more like a real car's brake. That being said, I've not driven any race cars myself, so my experience is purely based on road cars. Anyway, let's move on. The load cells were quite massive in the Pro brake pedal, and it's gotten a lot smaller in the Sprint, despite the overall force on the pedal going up. Did you realize that the Pro load cell was just hugely overdimensioned, or what was the reason why you could now go for a much smaller load cell?
Yeah, one of the reasons was that when we designed, at that point was mostly me in 2012, 2013. You just go online, you look for load cells, and you find a suitable one. And that's, well, we're going to use that. We're going to order 10, and that's what we're going to do. But now we are talking much larger quantities, and we have a good relationship with the load cell supplier. So back in the design stage, I had a new idea to make the pedal more compact, and it will also require a more compact load cell. They had something similar, so I asked, can you make a version of this small load cell with these mounting locations, and what sort of force can you make it handle? So the Pro and the Ultimate pedals were just chosen the load cell because of availability at that time, whereas with the Sprints, we looked at what load cell would we like, what would fit, can they make it for us? So it's a slight modification of an existing load cell from them, but made specifically for us now. You cannot do that if you need 10, but if you order hundreds at a time, then they're more open to the idea of doing something custom for you. So it's more compact, but actually the rating is 120 kilos on it versus 60 kilo rating on the Pro pedal. So more evidence that the load cell size or rating doesn't really tell you a lot, really. So
Yeah. No, but I see that a lot of the improvements from the Pros to the Sprints come from the fact that you can now manufacture them in larger quantities, and that gives you leverage over suppliers to manufacture stuff at your specifications, right? Now the Sprints, they've become much more easy to live with, in my opinion, based on moving the electronics into the brake instead of having this breakout box that was then with your default pedal plate mounted under the pedal, which can be quite cumbersome to reach. Do you have a comment on that? I would just like to bring it up in terms of the improvements here of the brake pedal, because that's something that makes my life a lot easier living with them, and I'm very grateful for that.
It was a sort of a difficult decision to make because I mentioned a million times now, I wanted to have everything as compact as possible, but for the brake, even though we are on a third of the pedal arm now, so we have more leverage, we still needed a reasonably long stack of spring and rubber that had a certain length to it. And there was a little bit of space we had empty. And there's nothing that hurts me more than seeing unused space in a design. So we started thinking, can we include the electronics in there? And that is great if it works for packaging, but it can also be tricky because you expose, there's some really high forces going through there, and there's a fragile circuit board there. So it was a bit of a risky decision to see if that worked, but we coat the PCB, so if anything, shavings and stuff, should anything fall on there, it won't short circuit the circuit board. And we could just fit it with two connectors at each side for connecting the throttle and the clutch. It worked out marvelously, although electronic supplier wasn't initially very happy because we gave them very tight constraints that all the components have to fit in this size and nothing can be here and nothing can be there. So it's quite a tight fit, but it does work very well. And compared to, like you said, having a box mounted somewhere oddly, it's much more elegant. And thankfully, we haven't seen a lot of issues with it as well. It was it's you can also, you want to make things more compact and integrated, but not at the cost of making it fragile or easy to nudge or something. So there is a little depending on when you have your sprints, we tend to sort of silently make tiny little upgrades over the years. But there is a little like an elephant's trunk almost protecting the USB connector and stuff like that. So it has worked out very well for us, but we took a bit of a design risk there, to be perfectly honest, but we haven't been bitten by it. There's always somebody, who trips over his pedal set, and then you shear off the cable or the connector, but that would happen regardless of where the circuit board is mounted. And you can still get it off with a single screw and a connector, so we can still send out replacements. So in hindsight, it was tricky and risky, but it hasn't caused issues. Certainly not that outweigh the benefits of having it designed like this. Yeah.
And then one important difference that I've noticed in the sprints versus the pros is they appear to have tighter tolerances. So in the joints, I noticed this on the pro brake, especially when I had the coiled spring at the end of the rubber stack and I pushed it in just a little, it would wiggle ever so slightly left to right. It was a bit of a problem when heel and towing, because then you have the force on the pedal not going straight down, but sideways a little, and then the pedal face would shift a little, and then it was more difficult to trust your brake pedal, which obviously is very important when you're racing. And in the sprints, there is, as far as I can tell, absolutely no slack that I could observe in any of the pedals, even if you just push it in a little where there's usually a bit more. So you certainly looked into that region as well.
Yeah, a few things happened there. So initially, or all the time with the Pro pedals, the shaft over which the pedal pivots is obviously a round shaft with a certain dimension, but those tolerances were large-ish, and the bushings, they were just pressed into the holes that were laser cut. And since the bushings are sort of a brass material that's fairly soft, that worked well. But you get a variability in a few areas. The outer diameter of the shaft was not perfectly toleranced. The length of that shaft wasn't perfectly toleranced. So the pedal could move left and right a little bit and also wiggle a little bit, but that would depend on the tolerance of the day, really. And for the sprint pedals, we now get our shafts made from like a CNC turning factory. They use like actual shaft material with a minimum and maximum tolerance that we know. And the holes in which we press the bearings are now, I think it's called using a reamer. So we laser cut the holes too small, and then we make them to size, exactly to size. So the bearing presses in nicely and the resulting hole has known tolerances. So, and the lateral movement, we now have a little spring washer in there, so that it's never tight and doesn't move, and it's also not able to move left and right. So we really did tighten that up, and the tolerances are there. There's, if at the bottom of the pedal you have 0.05 millimeters of travel, then all the way up in the top it's already a millimeter. So, and it's also something, if you would fiddle with real race pedals, you would be shocked how often there is play on them as well. So sometimes in the case of the Pro pedals, I think it was fair sometimes that people said, yeah, this is too much. Absolutely. But anything that moves freely will have a little bit of play to it, but it's a lot more consistent and way less on the sprint pedals. Yeah. And just to iterate that, with the Ultimate pedals that we are still selling, initially they were made the same as the Pro pedals. But like I said, just with the sprint, we've made a tiny couple of changes over the years. With the Ultimate pedals as well, we are now using the accurate axles, and we've upgraded the bearings as well. So they are as good or better than the sprint pedals when it comes to rigidity and lack of wiggle. So it's a sort of evolution that we had to apply to the Ultimate pedals once we knew better bearings and axles were available.
You improved the adjustability of the pedals with regards to the angle at which it's in the idle state. The Pro pedals, they were rather straight up, and you could then get them to go even further almost. And the sprint pedals now by default, they sit more like this, and you still have the option of making them really upright. But I guess you have a bit of a more relaxed position available as well, that I think to me is especially helpful if your seat is considerably higher than the pedal base, because then your legs will come in at a steeper angle, I guess, and you don't have to get this weird angle in your ankles.
Yeah, no, it's a very good thing for you to notice, because I think that sometimes that doesn't get noticed, and that's one of the things I'm more proud of with the spring pedals. If you can be proud of something, a design, but relatively, it makes me feel good when I see that, because it's like I said with the throttle, it's easy to make something small, but it's harder to make something small that is also still strong, not just that it doesn't break, but also gives you a lot of back force. And imagine with the brake pedal, we talked about the motion ratio, like we now mount it at 3:1. That makes the required length of rubbers shorter, and that also it compresses everything together. And the more you want to angle your pedal, the room underneath gets smaller. If you have the base is horizontal, if your pedal is upright, you have a lot of space here to put your stuff. It's easy, and you make it huge. But the more you angle this, the more you squish your available space, and you still need things to be like perpendicular to each other. You really get into trouble making this angle, where exactly like you said. And I think we should probably even at some point do like an ergonomics video, because I'm sure a lot of people have pedals that are really straight with their seats high, and then here's the pedal, and then your foot is here, and it doesn't, it doesn't hinge with each other. You're sort of here, and then you raise your heel plate, but your heel should always be close to the pedal, so you get a nice sort of coexisting motion. But some people with high rigs and vertical pedals, I have no idea how they operate it, and it can be really uncomfortable if the pedal angle isn't like a comfortable heel angle for your foot. And like you said, having to retract your foot all the way is very uncomfortable. So it was a very big goal to make the pedals as compact as possible to allow the biggest angle possible. So it's about 25 degrees of center, and I think the Pro pedals are 10 degrees of center, and that makes a pretty big difference, and is something that I think is easily overlooked. And I'm not here to point fingers, but there are a lot of pedals out there that are quite vertical, and you can make that work, but you have to make sure that either the pedals are quite high compared to your seat, or you angle the entire pedals in a way, which is often possible depending on the rig you have. But comfort and ergonomics are really important, and we thought that, well, if we can angle them 25 degrees off center, and then with the brackets allow them to go vertical, we offer more range. There he is again, with the spring pedals offering a greater range of adjustment than the Pros. But it's quite a big thing that a lot of rigs have higher seats, and you don't want vertical pedals there. It's really uncomfortable.
The last minor change that I noticed is that the slots through which you put the screws when you mount the pedals onto a pedal plate, I think you went either from M6 to M4 or from M8 to M6, I'm not quite sure, but you went for smaller screws to mount the pedals down. Is that to have them closer to each other, or what was the idea?
No, it's just, I was mainly looking at the Pro, and we use M6 there on the base and M5 on the pedal arm. Just re-evaluating, is this necessary? I mean, an M4 or an M5 bolt, it's 10 cents or 11 cents, so this wasn't really a cost thing. It's just that, is it necessary to have such big bolts for these forces? And I couldn't find a reason to do it other than adding weight, which is a downside. So that's why we went down a step. You can probably hang an elephant from one of those M5 bolts, right? So it was unnecessary to have 6mm bolts there. That's why we went down a step.
Another thing that is, I guess, massively improved is the software. You were using the DI View software on the Pros, and now you have your own in-house software suite. Previously, for the Pros, we just set the point of load cell reading at where the reading would go 0, and we would set the 100% point. And then we had to take out the calculator and find the middle point between that to get like a linear curve. Now you offer like a very easy to set up thing with a lot of variety. You can now apply, you can very easily set up the minimum, like the initial dead zone that you have in a pedal, as well as the maximum force that you need to press it. And then you can apply various curves, predefined curves, or you can make up your own curve for the interpolation between those points, S curves, gamma curves, and so on. First of all, can you tell us a little bit about the thinking that went into that? And also, how much is this something that you find in reality as well?
Well, it first came out of sort of necessity because, like you said, using DI view is not really something, we mentioned going with a more design that looked a bit better, packaging that's better, just more of a finished product that we can, with a nice manual, everything is made a big step, and then say to the people, "I'll download this shady software that's written 20 years ago and get your calculator out," that doesn't fit. Plus, you would be surprised how, you might be, I'm just looking at you, I don't really know. You could be a bit of a nerd who understands computers, but a lot of guys in iRacing or in RF2, they're not really gamer computer nerds who know how DOS commands and stuff work. So we got a surprising number of emails questioning how I only get this output, why is it like that? I get a dead zone, how do I do that? So we continuously had to explain how DI-View worked, and we were sort of tired of that. And at some point we were gonna get like hardware calibration done, but that never happened. Then we switched a manufacturer from to the Springs with a new PCB, and they also do the software. So we said hardware calibration is essential. So when we package the final pedals, we take a set, mount them in a jig, and calibrate them to a standard value with dead zones and 30 kilos on the brake, I think. Then we put it in a package. It's hardware calibrated, so you don't have to do anything anymore in Windows, because Windows assumes that if you haven't calibrated, you use the 0 to 4000 range on each pedal, and that's also the output that the pedal has after we calibrate it. It sort of normalizes that, okay, whatever you calibrated now becomes 0 to 4000. So you take the whole DI-View thing out of there, making it a lot easier for people to just plug and play and calibrate right away in games that are not iRacing. And iRacing you still have to calibrate, but you would just press them all the way and it would already have slight dead zones, and it would also work more easily. So we took a whole bunch of support questions away, which is a selfish thing because it just takes up time. But it's also annoying when you don't know how it works. You have to send an email, and we typically respond within a day or two, but then you have issues, right? So if you provide a bit of software that's easier to use, or you have pre-calibrated pedals, it just takes a lot of hassle and headache away from the customer as well as from us. So that's a win-win. And then we thought, well, if we do a hardware calibration anyway, what else can we do? Profiles, that's easy. Nice idea. Input-output curves. And to my surprise, actually, I think we are the first to do that with sim racing pedals. And now I think they say you should be flattered when others follow suit. But in reality, of course, this input-output curvature is being pretty normal, I think, in flight sim jokes and software and pedals. It's definitely not a new, unique thing. It's fairly obvious, but I think we were one of the first to do it for sim racing pedals. The reason, in regarding the throttle pedal, especially in real cars, you can have any sort of relationship between the pedal and actually the air going into the engine. Some cable operated throttle pedals have like a dozen or so points where you can tie the cable to get a different linearity on the pedal. And sometimes in game as well, you can adjust the sensitivity of the axis. In R-factor based games, you can make it very sensitive or less sensitive, effectively changing the point where on the pedal where the throttle cable attaches to get linear or less linear travel. So we figured, let's just, since we are doing hardware calibration anyway, we might as well do profiles with curves that people can set, which is mostly just really subjective. Personally, I just keep everything linear, but this is also a point where perhaps you are playing F1 2020, which I have not played, or other games where they might be geared a bit more towards arcade or simcade, and perhaps the programmers decided to make the brake non-linear because that feels better with a pad. That feels terrible with a pedal. Then you can sort of figure out that the initial force is not sensitive in this game. Let's do a curvature that increases the initial sensitivity. So even if the game doesn't work with my load cell pedals out of the box, I can sort of massage the curves and tweak more games to my liking and more cars to my liking. That if a car has a super sensitive throttle, you can make a curve. So is it needed for most modern like good sims? Probably not necessarily, but it's nice to have that option to tweak. And to be honest, there's always people who think that the more things they can tweak, the better the lap times will become. So it's nice to have that feature of tweaking, and there is a benefit for the clutch as well. If you the zone where you really get the bite, you can make that zone cover more of the travel. So you might actually get a slightly better launch if you tweak that for each car. So there is some usefulness to it. People also use it in iRacing to limit the maximum force of the brake, which is something I'm not really a fan of, because you can always lower the output to 50%, and then you will never lock the tires, but you will also leave braking distance on the table. So the ideal brake strength is one where all the tires can lock up with full fuel and a grippy track. So you still have to do it yourself. But on cars that are so sensitive, and you could argue strangely programmed, where even in optimal conditions with high fuel, grippy track, grippy tires, you still lock up at 50% brake force, that's weird. And then you can customize that curve to max out at 50% and have more control over the brake pedal. So it's we see people enjoying tweaking, and there's actual usages for less realistic games or weird cars in games to make them a bit better to drive.
My first bonus question would be to hear a bit about the history of the pedals. Like, how long does it take you, or did it take you to develop the pros and then the sprints, from like the first idea to the first batch that you shipped?
So with the pro pedals, I remember in December 2012, I had 10 sort of prototypes of a very different design that I sold on iRacing forums. It was very heavy, over engineered, too heavy, too bulky, vertical. If you talk about huge load cells, the one in there was absolutely massive. So that gave me the knowledge that people want to buy this because they were sold in a weekend on the iRacing forums. But also, okay, they're too heavy, too bulky, so we need to optimize that. And then I think October 2013, so 8, 9, 10 months after the first batch of pro pedals was assembled and sold. So there's complete new design, but not from scratch, because then I was already working on pedal design that wasn't as good, but it's already in your mind, and that makes it very hard to tell you how long it takes to design something, because when you sit down to design something, it never works. And then when you're taking a shower and you went out for a walk, then suddenly you come back with half a design. So it's very hard to quantify the design. I think from 2015 to 2018, some sketches, half a prototype, then put it on the back burner, work on an H pattern shifter or something. And then a year later, go back to those sketches. You find some new information about suppliers that can do custom bushings, rubber bushings, for example. That opens up possibilities. It's a really continuous but not full-time thing. And I find it especially important to put it to the side. No H shifter jokes here, but
and we'll
put
get
it to the
that
side for a while, and then when you come back, you always have a new sort of fresh look at it. What? That's stupid. Why not do it this way and that way? So design is not in my head anyway, it doesn't work like a 9 to 5. It's just your mind. It's like some sort of a cycle that sometimes an idea flashes in front of you. You have to grab it, and then if you see nothing, you can think about it, but it won't magically appear. So it's sort of a mixture of waiting for things to appear and trying to force things to happen. But overall, it's probably over a 2-3 year period where various prototypes slowly evolve and then get put aside and gather dust, and then half a year later another idea. So it's very hard to say if this wouldn't work if I was like working for a company and they would employ me to design something, and after a year there's still nothing. You know, we have the freedom, thankfully, because the Pro pedals were fine and they did the job very well. We were in no rush to come out with the sprint pedals. It was mainly for our own. Okay, let's try to keep ahead of the field because we see some competition. We have some ideas to improve it. So yeah, we'd like to have a better pedal set eventually, but it doesn't have to be done next week. We'd rather have it be done properly in 2 years. So yeah, a long story with no definitive answer, just a slow, gradual progress. And I'm always sketching some half ideas and always scratching my chin. So pedal ideas are sort of constantly being sketched, and who knows, someday a prototype might be built, and who knows, one day we might decide, this is Sprint 2.0 or Ultimate 2.0, or we're gonna just scrap it because it doesn't work. It's sort of a continuous process.
What is your main planning tool or engineering tool when you construct these pedals? Do you just work in spreadsheets as you've, I guess, as you do a lot for physics when you work on Automobilista or used to work on Automobilista cars, or do you have like a special software where you can sort of engineer them in software before actually putting the hardware together?
I do all my sketching is still 2D CAD, just old-fashioned, something I feel very comfortable with. It's like an infinitely sized sketch. Sketching on paper for initial ideas is good, but then you need the proportions and the dimensions to figure out, okay, but I think we can get a flatter angle of the pedal, but in a sketch it's always possible. When you put the things together one to one, it might not be. So I do a whole bunch of sketching in just 2D AutoCAD, and when there's a new mechanism or I want to know the forces of the operational forces of the pedal, there's always a model in a spreadsheet, and then I optimize that because the model tells me with this spring and with these pivot points I get the desired force, and then I go back to CAD and just a 2D side view. Okay, so there's my spring. Is there room for an end stop? Where does it go? So it's sort of a combination of 2D sketching and calculation tools.
Now we've talked a lot about the sprints and the pros, and obviously you mentioned a couple of times that of course you also have a even more pro pedal set, the Ultimates, available. Now they look very similar to the pros. The sprints now bringing this almost new design language into it also begs the question, is there a similar update visually but also in some other aspects planned for the Ultimates, or is that something that right now you cannot talk about basically?
Well, when I just mentioned that I'm always sketching and trying things, that also means that there are ideas for eventual replacements to the Ultimate, but more sort of relevant is that first I mentioned that we already made upgrades throughout the times to the Ultimate pedals. So the pivot points, the axles and the bearings, they've been gradually upgraded over the years. We also put bearings in the little eye joints where the spring shafts meet the pedal arm. They would be a major point that could start to squeak if you didn't lubricate it properly. Now we have bearings in there, so that doesn't squeak anymore. That's been a gradual improvement over the last year, 2 years, something like that. So the main sort of points of the Pro pedals that we wanted to improve in the sprints those issues have been taken out of the current Ultimate pedals. We are going to launch a new circuit board with smart control, because it's something you would expect if your mid-range sort of high-end consumer product has that software. Why doesn't your high-end set have it? Well, it's not that easy. It's a really complicated new hardware, and we cannot just apply that software to the old hardware, so we had to develop a new circuit board. So that's the circuit board seems to work fine. We're testing, that's all good, but we're going to launch it with a couple more updates to You could basically call it Ultimate 1.5. And there's no definitive date on it yet, but it will, of course, all the improvements we made to the bearings and stuff, they remain. And a couple more updates as well as the circuit board. So that will be, with the software and the updates will bring a nice upgrade that will also be possible to purchase if you already have Ultimates. So you get a circuit board and a couple more things. But that's for hopefully introduced later this year and will last us a while. But yeah, I'm not gonna lie about the idea of one day replacing the Ultimates altogether with Ultimate 2.0 or whatever we're gonna call it. But like I mentioned, it can take years of sketching and throwing it away and prototypes, where we have not even made a prototype of the half ideas I have for Ultimate 2.0. And it could be a year or 2 or 3 years. And meanwhile, the Ultimate update that we're going to launch later will be a nice upgrade and really make them fine for the coming year or 2, however long it takes. But a couple of things, the Ultimates are quite bulky and I like to engineer something more compact. And just like with the Sprints, a wider range of operation. So if you want to use 20 kilos on Ultimate, now you get no travel. I think it should be possible to one day design a pedal that has a huge range, the squishiest road pedal to the stiffest Formula 1 pedal. So I have ideas that I want to incorporate, but that's going to be a matter of very secret, slow development, typically really slow. For some reason I don't do things quickly. And we will iterate many prototypes over the next few years, and at some point, yeah, but it's not on the horizon. So Ultimate 1.5 is on the horizon. Nice upgrade with software and a couple of other things that will make the Ultimate pedals current for another couple of years.
You mentioned that the software is going to get an update on the Ultimates. Now, in updating the software and the PCBs and the electronics in those pedals, did at any point you consider making them compatible with consoles as well?
So, yeah, well, it's not that I'm against consoles, because realistically, a modern console is just a PC, right? Just more affordable. Traditionally, we've been wary of it for a few reasons. First of all, you need to go to Sony or Microsoft, and I have no idea what it would cost, but you cannot just... What? Yeah,
or Nintendo. For Mario Kart.
Nintendo, yeah. It will be expensive, probably expensive, we assume, but we don't really know, to get your products licensed. And I'm sure that they will want some control, or they want to check, is this safe? If Sony or Microsoft officially acknowledges that a pedal can be used, that a child can insert his finger and break his finger, there might be a whole bunch of things there we just don't know if that's easy or not, and what is the cost that is involved. We all come from a PC sim racing background, and where you can tweak, and how would you do the software? Do you want sprint pedals on your console without smart control? How would you do the software? So it's a whole big layer of complexity. But you also see that Assetto Corsa Competizione is out for consoles, right? So that's a hardcore sim. So it's not that the consoles aren't sim worthy, but we just don't really know how to make the hardware work, what is involved to make the software work, what sort of licensing cost would there be. Plus, we see the PC market is still growing quite fast, and we are currently happy to be able to supply the pedals in this sort of niche market. Because every time you enter a new market, there is opportunity, but there's also risks and issues, and a whole different sort of customer. So perhaps any sort of adjustability you have, that sort of a hardcore PC sim racer will be comfortable with a spanner, but perhaps the console audience isn't as comfortable, or you cannot expect them to make the adjustments with the same sort of geeky PC master race mindset. It's probably a different type of person occasionally anyway. So there's a whole bunch of question marks that surround it. Not against it. It might be something in the long term we will investigate, because consoles and PCs are growing towards each other in hardware and software. but it's not on our immediate minds, but it's not out of some superiority that PC gaming is where it's at or something. That's not like that. Who knows in the future?
Yeah, we already talked about the Ultimates, the 1.5. Are there other products in development that people should look forward to? And in particular, is that one product, is there any update on that thing?
What?
We talked about this in the last interview we made at the Sim Racing Expo in 2019, and back then you said that for now it's basically been it's been put in the shelf. You've stopped working on it, and it's delayed indefinitely. It's been almost 2 years now since we talked. So has anything changed since then?
Not really. So we've already accidentally leaked. So I guess I could as well tell you that there will be a new handbrake coming out later, probably this year. Out when it's out, no pre-orders, nothing. If nothing blows up, it should definitely be this year, but no promises. We don't do that anymore.
It sounds very similar to what I heard when I tested the H pattern when I visited your factory.
We are, so that's we are really sort of, we don't really want to announce it, but it was already in a brochure of Demon Tweaks. So technically the news is out there. There will be a new handbrake at some point, which is more compact, more adjustability, yada yada, the same story as with the sprints. If I wasn't an engineer, you would think I was a marketing person, but really it's an improvement in many areas, and that's one that's on the cards. Nothing like, it's not a totally new game changer of a handbrake, but it's nice and improved, and it will have smart control. There is another thing we're working on, but that's not really for consumers. We do have things in the works, and we've also grown to the point where we now have more engineering capacity as well. So we are probably going to look in the future at all of the products to see, okay, like the 1.5 version of the Ultimate, what can we do eventually to the Sprint, some comfort adjustments, make adjustability easier. Can we do something to the base plate? Can we make that less annoying to put together? So we're sort of thinking of small updates perhaps, but this is not a product announcement. It's just something now we have more engineering capacity. We want to see if we can make some improvements to existing products. A handbrake will come eventually, in years. New Ultimate pedals of course will come. We're continuously sketching and doing, but we will not make the mistake anymore like we did with the H pattern shifter, where we announced it too early and promise a release date, when in fact turns out that the whole mechanism works okay but isn't good enough, right? So the idea is that we will no longer announce products until we have a whole bunch assembled, ready to ship. That's the plan. But since the handbrake leaked, we can say that now. H pattern, no, there's no new developments on that even since the last 2 years. To my surprise, the only working, well, there are 2 semi-working prototypes that's still in my rig. Hasn't broken, but the wear and tear that I expected is there. So it's easier to miss shifts than, because the teeth have worn up a little bit. So it's evidence that it's not completely terrible, but also evidence that, if we would have sold this, hundreds of them, and we start missing shifts after a year, it's not something we want to do. So it was the right decision not to go ahead with that. And, if I or one of the new guys who does engineering comes to the office with, now I've got this idea, we can do an H pattern shifter, we won't not do it. But at this point there is no design improvement that's being tested or anything. So holding your breath will still most likely kill you if you try. So don't do that.
All right. So we won't hold our breath for a Heusinkveld H pattern.
Thanks, in the near future. Reassuring.
We told people about your newest car 2 years ago. How is it doing? Is it still the same Fiesta non-slow turd version?
It's slow. It is slow.
Oh, you said it's only an ST if ST means slow turd.
I think that's the one. Yes. Yeah. No, I still have the ST. Yeah. I'm not too happy with it really. I think on my old Fiesta that I strangely liked, my brake booster was broken, because I had to put extra force on the brake pedal to stop. and that was a bad thing because I could not really get the tires to lock. Really had to press insane. That was probably not great, not safe. But I could modulate like really smooth, slow stops for like a roundabout, or I had very good control over between 0 and half a G. And this new Fiesta, it has so much like power assistance that here you are the brake, you feel nothing but the return spring, and you get that. It's so hard to modulate smoothly. I've learned to do that a little bit, but it's something that most modern cars, they have so much power resistance on the brakes, where the difference from just a return spring to actually slowing down is not felt really. It's just, so I don't like how that feels at all.
Yeah.
I got the brakes, the ABS system bled because there was some air in it. So at least now it grabs near the top of the pedal. When I just got the car, it was sort of 4 kilos nothing, and then 4.5 kilos dead stop. Terrible. And the power steering is quite assisted and has a bit of friction. I would much rather have my old car if the rear suspension wasn't rusting out underneath it. So I'm not yet a fan of these modern assisted cars. I just think my old one was broken and I preferred it. But well, it's a good reason to take the bicycle to the office instead of the car. So.
And you're in the Netherlands, where there's plenty of bicycle optimized roads around. So
yeah, it's a 10-kilometer drive to the office with no traffic lights when I go on the bicycle. A couple of hills, but that's something everybody else in the world would laugh at.
I was just going to say, that doesn't sound very much like the Netherlands.
Nah, it's probably like a 15-meter inclination over a mile or something. But
okay, yeah, that sounds more like it. Niels, thank you so much for this interview. And
yeah, thanks for having me. I always enjoy talking, and it's never as short as everybody expects. Oh, we're gonna have a 10-minute interview. No, that's I'm afraid that's impossible, and we've overshot that mark by a little bit. If the whole COVID thing goes away later, and you're looking forward to seeing how we operate now, always welcome to visit us at some point to see how the operation has grown and how we do things now. You're welcome to come visit at some point.
And that would be it. If you've made it to this point of the video, you're most likely one of a select few people, and I'm gonna assume you enjoyed this talk. In that case, please do leave a like under the video, subscribe, and ring the bell. Tell me in the comments below if you have any remaining questions about either the sprints or the pros, and let me know who else you'd like to see interviewed on this channel. And with this, have a nice rest of your day, be safe, and I'll see you in the next one.